Hi everyone, it's Raina. So this video is looking at the chart of David Icke, who is a British writer who writes on topics that people would consider conspiracy theories. I definitely don't like that term. I say conspiracy realist, and I consider myself one because I don't believe that these things are fanciful. I think that they are reality, and they just are not being reported on by mainstream sources, but it doesn't make them not real. And David Icke is somebody who changed my life over 20 years ago, um, when I read his first book. And the interesting thing about that, and this is how life works in terms of synchronicity, is that my mother, who was talking to some man about this book he was reading David Icke and talking about reptilians and things like that. And my mother thought that this guy was off his rocker. And so she was just laughing about it. And I probably laughed along with her. And then during that week, I was listening to some show on the radio, and a caller called in and mentioned David Icke. And that, for some reason, that like kind of turned on the light inside of me. And I thought, I have to investigate this guy. And so these were the days before people, well, no, this was after the internet was a thing, but it still wasn't, it was like the early 2000s. It might have been right, I think it was right around 2001, maybe after 9/11, when this happened. I feel like it was right around that time, and I got the first book when we still had borders around, and that was it. I went down the rabbit hole, and I really credit David Icke for opening up my mind to so many things that I just took for granted, or I just believed what was told to me. So the thing about it that recently kind of brought him up again was that I found out that Candace Owens, who is, you could call her like an independent journalist, she's a YouTuber, but she has many different platforms. She was touring with Charlie Kirk and Talking Points USA. So she, wore many media hats, but you could call it alternative media. Well, she's born on the same day, in a different year, in a different decade than David Icke. But they're both Taurus. So Taurus is not a sign at all that I connect with conspiratorial interests and, like beliefs. So I don't have her time of birth because I really would love to do her chart. And I sense like a strong Scorpio vibe and everything, all the personal plants I can find. There's nothing with Scorpio there. But of course, you can have the 8th house, which is Scorpio's domain. And David Icke has none of that. He has nothing in the 8th house. And he has he does have Mars in Scorpio. There you go. So I'll be talking about like what makes someone, have these kinds of beliefs. Basically, if you really want to boil it down to what conspiracy theorists are like, or I should say conspiracy realists are like, it's the belief that we should never take life at face value. Because certainly there are people that are trying to get us to believe certain narratives for their own benefit. And this can, this doesn't have to be just like the government or something like that. This can be like people that maybe it's a family member or a partner, anybody who stands to gain from you believing this or that. And some people might say that's a cynical attitude or it's an overly suspicious attitude. And that's fine if that's what people think. But whatever you want to call it, it's really probing. And that's where it has a connection to Scorpio. Scorpio is ruled by Mars and Pluto, and Mars is our drive and, what gets us motivated to do things. And Pluto is that purging of things that are rotten and hidden, in the dark, secrets. David Icke was ridiculed for his beliefs when he came out with them. And ridicule, the term conspiracy theorist was actually coined by the CIA in order to ridicule or marginalize free thinkers that were in the 60s that were like questioning the Vietnam War and the official narrative. And so ridicule, some people that are just kind of on automatic and just believing whatever is presented to them think, oh, if somebody is being ridiculed by multiple people, they must be a big joke. And really, we really should, when somebody is being ridiculed, we should say, wow, by multiple sources, we should say, wow, this person is really a target. Are they a threat to people who are deceiving us and they don't want that person to be believed? So it might be that person is right on time, that they are saying the truth and that these other people don't want to be exposed. So I'm going to talk about that aspect too, because that was his public image. And, he was like the punchline of jokes. And, is there anything to indicate that? And also his beliefs themselves. And, his spirituality, because this actually coincides with spirituality. He really makes a point of talking about how this control by these outer forces is something that is meant to keep us from understanding how powerful we are as co-creators with God. So anyway, David Icke is a Taurus and he has the moon in Cancer. So these are two signs that I consider to be very traditional. One interesting thing about Cancer as a sign, and he has the North Node in the 4th house. Actually, interestingly enough, his North Node is in Aquarius, which is perfect. Because it's the sign of the eccentric individual, the nonconformist, and he has in the house of home and family and your homeland. So this is the North Node is your soul's mission. So he actually has his South Node in the house of career. So there's something karmic about career for him, his reputation, his public image. There's something karmic about that, which can simply mean that it's not necessarily something for him to really try to maintain or focus on. Not that, a person who has a South Node in a certain house should just completely ignore the affairs of that house or the sign that house is in. It simply means that it's a comfort zone, for that person. So it comes easily to them. And he did wear different hats. He was initially a soccer player, and I believe, like a professional, but I think it was a professional. I think he had some kind of injury early on, or that he was unable to do that anymore. And then he became what they call in the UK a presenter, meaning an anchor person. an anchorman. I think that was the name of that movie with Will Ferrell, the anchorman. But, somebody who is telling the news. So that is one thing that I find very interesting too, because he had a connection to the media before he started writing these books on the secret history of the universe, if you will. And one thing that I love about, I do recommend his books. One thing that I love about them is that it's kind of like, if you are a history buff, this is going to turn you upside down, inside out, because you're going to start to question everything that you've been taught about every war, everything, like what the real motivations were for it, who are the real players, who was pulling the strings. All of that stuff is going to be like turned upside down. And Cancer in the fourth house have to do with the past. So people who have a prominent Cancer, like David Icke, and maybe some of you out there have the moon in Cancer or the sun in Cancer, tend to be history buffs. They tend to be very interested in other historical periods. And Cancer is a water sign, so it's very retentive. It retains dates and facts and things like that. Cancer has a wonderful memory because Cancer specializes in the past. So that can play out in terms of how these kinds of people, what their fixation is on. Or, you could say too with the moon, rather than fixation, what their emotional ties are going towards. And it's very rooted in the past. His Mercury is in Aries and his Venus is in Aries. In terms of the significance with that Mercury is that Aries is also ruled by Mars, just like Scorpio is co-ruled by Mars. Aries is totally ruled by Mars. So when somebody has Mercury in Aries, it's like, if you've seen the symbol of Mars, it is like an arrow. And it's also, you could say, like the bullseye in a sense, because it has that circular part to it. And it's like the person is very blunt in speech, but they're also not afraid. There's a bravery in their speech. And they also have this sense of, it's almost like, being provocative in speech, wanting their speech to rile people up. When people online talk about trolls, that is what a troll is supposed to be about. Like, they just want to upset people, get a reaction from people. And, I don't personally believe that many people are pure trolls. I think a lot of people are paid to, stir the pot. But somebody with Mercury in Aries, they may love to argue, and not argue necessarily where it's full of animosity, but like debating, because that Martian energy, that it's like competitive energy, it's like concentrated in the speech. And so a person like this enjoys their verbal battles because it's something that they could feel very confident in their speech and in the way that they think, I believe. Because, and that's very important for a Taurus, because Taurus to me can be a rather slow sign. I don't mean not intelligent. I mean that there's not like that, quick on the uptake. It's more like everything is coming very leisurely. And the reason that this is important, if you will, is because Taurus is ruled by Virgo, by Venus, and Venus is very harmonious or wanting to be harmonious. Um, Aries is ruled by Mars, and so there's that love of stirring things up. And so Mars is in Scorpio. And that's the one thing where, well, besides Pluto in the 10th house, I think that's another big piece of the puzzle here. But so Mars in Scorpio means that the person, it's like the investigative reporter who can't let go of something until they strip it down to the bare kernel of truth. And so this sort of person, let's see where the Mars is in. The Mars is in the first house of the South. So there can be, I think when you have Mars in the first house, it can be also rather defensive. I think he already is kind of defensive, but he has been put on the defensive by other people's reactions. So he has the Sun opposing Mars. And the Sun is coming from the 7th house, as is Jupiter. Seventh house can be public relations. So it can speak to, the person who maybe they can really make a name for themselves with both the Sun and Jupiter there. And his Sun and Jupiter are in conjunction. So I think it basically means somebody who has a lucky, I was going to say a lucky streak, but it's really more of a permanent thing. Basic positive vibes and attitude in life. But just kind of like when I say attitude, I mean even aspirations. Jupiter rules the sign of Sagittarius. And so this is a sub-influence. When you have a conjunction between the Sun and Jupiter, it's like having the Sun in Sagittarius. So we're talking about his Sun being in Taurus, but he has a conjunction with Jupiter, so it has that Sagittarius sub-influence, and then it's in the 7th house, which is Libra's domain, so it has a sub-influence of Libra as well. So you can see right away, and then having Mars in the 1st house, that he is atypical for a Taurus person in some ways. And so in terms of that opposition between his Sun and Mars, this can indicate someone who is very, like, how would I put it? They have a chip on their shoulder, or that might be, I don't know if that's more of the square is also hard angle, just like the opposition. A person who feels like a perpetual underdog in life. And same with having Saturn in the 12th house. The person can feel like, and like I said, he experienced an injury when he was in sports, which made him have to stop playing soccer. So that could have given him this feeling that life was against him. He does have, I think he has an autobiography, but he has recounted his life, and I have read about it. I just haven't read about it recently. But I would imagine for anybody that would be quite a disappointment. And, Saturn is the lord of karma, and when it's in the 12th house, it's in the house of karma. So it can really emphasize that sometimes there is such a thing as fate that you have to accept, that you cannot change, and that it isn't always about being in control of all things that happen to you, but how you handle it, how you are able to kind of move on from disappointment and things like that. Saturn can be obstacles. So in the 12th house, it can be karma in the form of these obstacles. And, he had this spiritual awakening. Again, this is all from memory, so I might be missing some details. When I don't think he believed he was God. He might have understood that he was part of God, and he started dressing. I think it was like all in turquoise or something like that, and he had like this very unusual reaction to some sort of spiritual upgrade, or that's my interpretation of it. And he got totally ridiculed for that, and laughed at. And so I'm going to talk about that. Like, where would that come from? Well, I think one of the things where it's coming from, he has Mercury forming a square with Uranus and opposing Neptune and opposing Saturn. Now, that is really interesting about the opposition between Mercury and Saturn, because Saturn is the authority figure. And that certainly we can look at the world as our authority figure that is telling us what to do. And if we talk back to it and say, I think you're full of shit, I don't really agree with you, then what happens to us? So he kind of was bucking authority, and then he had to face the kind of public humiliation, by people that tried to marginalize him and make him seem like his ideas were completely worthless, because he's obviously crazy. And maybe, sometimes these people that do undergo massive spiritual awakening, they do kind of go crazy because they're stepping out of that old paradigm. And to the world, this is what insanity looks like. We don't consider believing, the lies of the Matrix to be insanity. It might be going along with the program, but it's considered perfectly normal. So it's kind of interesting how that works. So I wouldn't be surprised if he's neurodivergent. And I don't remember him talking. He might have talked about this, about how he did in school, if he had learning issues. He has Chiron in the 3rd house. The 3rd house is elementary school. It is our education, the foundations of our education, so those earlier years. And it is our mind, I would call it the mundane mind. And Chiron is the wounded healer. So it indicates a sensitive wound that, once healed, can help heal others. If you have Chiron in the 3rd house, and let's say you have dyslexia or some other type of learning disability or difficulty, and yet you persevere, and then you decide to become a teacher to help other children, that would be an example of this. But he also has Chiron in Capricorn. This could be the father wound. He has Mars square Pluto, which is the classic, challenging aspect that I see with abuse. So I don't know his family life and if he suffered that way. But it would make sense because of just the way that old souls, which he probably is, tend to experience life, which is that there are a lot of hurdles, and also, we could say too that when I say the father one, maybe he had a great relationship with his father, but the father is the authority figure that he's trying to fight, but it seems like it's this insurmountable thing. And it's interesting because eventually he probably realized that the fight is an illusion, because if we're trying to make other people respect our beliefs or understand where we're coming from, we could be banging our head against the wall. It doesn't even matter if somebody believes what you believe. All that matters is that you are confident in what you think, and you don't need validation. So that's what the authority figure symbolizes to me, is that external validation. And he does have Libra rising, which sometimes does want to be accepted, to be approved of. And, that must have been very difficult for him, having Libra rising, and also having the moon in Cancer, to be honest with you, because Cancer is a sign that's very sensitive, hypersensitive to oneself and to ridicule in particular. And that can be very upsetting for people with the moon in Cancer to have to endure, because they are very sensitive souls. So I'm just looking at some of the other, but when I was talking about somebody who's neurodivergent, Mercury square Uranus, and also that opposition between Mercury and Neptune. And that's because sometimes when a person is maybe having a spiritual awakening, getting downloads or researching, and they're really into it, it's not all methodical and nice and neat. It may come out very erratically, and it's hard to decipher, it's hard to convey to others. And also, if a person has that square between, I think I have that as well, between the moon and Uranus, or I have the opposition maybe. No, I mean Mercury. I'm sorry, Mercury and Uranus. It can be that the person is ahead of their time, or they are, very independent as thinkers, but they're not well received by others for some reason. And again, there could be reasons for this, like maybe they communicate in a way that's convoluted, and other people just, not only is the information difficult to grasp, but it's also being presented in a way that is hard to really trust, or for whatever reason. I mean, that doesn't sound like how David Icke is, though, because he does come across in a very relatable way. I think most people could read his material and not feel that it was over their head or anything like that. He does go into, he usually has themes for his books that focus on one area. And he has a whole book on he actually has 2 books that he dedicated to 9/11. And then he has, a book about Children of the Matrix, talking about things that, like satanic ritual abuse, that were considered outlandish a couple of decades ago. Now, we do not even think twice about that kind of stuff. I mean, some people still do, but it's anyway, the point is that it doesn't mean that if you have a hard angle, I don't believe that it means that the person is not good at communicating. It just means that the timing may be off for one reason or the other. Like I was saying, being ahead of your time tends to, and he certainly is. There's no question about that he was talking about these things. And sometimes it took decades for it to really make sense that this is real. And so it was easy to be laughed at as a crackpot. And the opposition from Mercury to Neptune can simply be, Mercury to me is more about what we would consider factual versus Neptune, which can be fabricated, imaginary, creative, but not necessarily factual. And so it's like, which is reality and which is fiction? And that's kind of like a philosophical idea, because it's like, is this real world really real? So anything of this world, is it really real? Or is the thing that we talk about with our fantasies, are those like really dreams? Are they, when you read these old science fiction writers like H.G. Wells or somebody like that, and you read some of this stuff and you're like, whoa, wait a second, that kind of sounds like this theory or this invention that didn't exist at that time. What was going on with those kinds of people? Were they having visions of the future? And, you can, when they put it down on paper, it may have seemed like a wild imagination, but they may have been envisioning the future in terms of invention. So it really is like not that clear what is fantasy and what is reality, ultimately. And so that might be something that is something that other people kind of projected, when you're talking about these oppositions, it could be his relationships with other people and them, when he's trying to communicate, them thinking that he is talking about some kind of fantasy rather than actual reality. So the other thing I wanted to mention is that 10th house. When Pluto is in your natal 10th house, there can be a great transformation in your public image. And this also goes for your career of choice. So somebody who starts out as a professional athlete and then ends up doing the type of writing and, thinking about the truth of life and trying to investigate that is a far cry from being an athlete. And it's amazing when somebody can wear all those hats like he did, being part of the media for a while. So just on that level, Pluto in the 10th house can be all about that. And then when you add to the aspect of his, what you would call like a downfall, because that's what Pluto in the 10th house can indicate, some kind of downfall. Now, yes, it might be like a scandal, like a scandalous thing. In this case, it was in terms of his reputation, which the 10th house represents, almost getting obliterated, you could say. That he lost that conventional reputation by having that spiritual awakening and losing all credibility, and I'm putting that in air quotes, because when somebody is a journalist in the conventional sense, they're going to gain a following from the public that is based around the information that they're disseminating. And if they seem credible, if they seem believable, then the public will put their faith in them. And then if they go off the rails, which that's what it looked like, he's dressing all in turquoise and, having, behaving maybe a bit oddly, I don't know, that could have totally, Pluto can be like death, totally killed off that career for him, because there was no longer the ability for the public to trust him to, tell them what was happening. The irony about that is that that was the best thing that ever happened to him, because then he was able to expose how deceptive the media is. And so it was like no great loss, in other words, that happened. But you can have somebody who has Pluto in the 10th house, and you track them from, let's say, the age of 22, maybe when they graduate college or get their first real job, and then 30 years later, see where they are. It's not so much saying, okay, let's see how successful they are, because it's about their transformation and what they decide to do with their life professionally. And it could be wildly different than when they first started, in other words. David has a conjunction between the moon and Uranus, and this can be like having the moon in Aquarius and add to that unconventional nature. And he does have this in the 9th house, and he speaks about having a spiritual experience. I believe he said it was at Lake Titicaca, and I believe that's in the mountains of Peru. I think it was, but it like a mountain lake or something like that. He had some kind of spiritual experience somewhere in South America like that, and that was probably just like one of his many. You could call them like spiritual upgrades or something along those lines. And the fact that this happened in a foreign country, I mean, the moon represents 9th house represents long distance travel, and the moon represents the intuitive. And the fact that it's in conjunction with Uranus, which can be the Kundalini awakening. So this foreign trip induced that. I'm sure location had everything to do with it. And so that's very interesting to see here. But also in terms of the 12th house, I said he has Saturn here, but he also has Neptune. And Neptune can be like an open channel to the higher realms. The only issue with this is that it might not be very controlled, meaning that the person may have these times when they come online that way. Or in the case of a schizophrenic, it might happen very frequently where they're in and out of so-called reality. So that's the interesting thing about the person with spiritual gifts versus the schizophrenic. It's a very fine line. It's all a matter of control, of being able to turn off that, whatever you want to call it, that access to the higher frequency. or other dimensions. I remember when I was getting attuned to Reiki, they were telling us about what we say that's basically kind of turn on and turn off the energy. And I remember being very skeptical because I thought, I don't think it works that way. I don't think that, you can just, if you want to turn something off, you don't have to say a particular phrase or, make a gesture or whatever. But I can understand why they might want to do that, because they might want to really be conscious of the fact that they are now turning off that connection, because they don't want to be constantly inundated with, spiritual influences. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of go into it. I'm a little bit surprised. And also he has Mercury in the 6th house, which is the house of work. It's a house of health and other things, but it's a house of work. So the writer having that in the 3rd house. I mean, the 3rd house is the house of Mercury, but in the 6th house, Mercury is also the ruler of the 6th, but it's in more of a practical kind of nonfiction sense in Virgo. But, what he does have in the 3rd house that is supposed to be writing, for instance, is Chiron. So his writing can be of a healing nature, both for himself and others. So that's what I have on David Icke. I hope you enjoyed this. If you would like a private reading, please click on the link below for more details. Take care. Bye.